If you are Australian, what happens to Medicare when you move overseas? Aaron here from Offshore in Asia. So if you're interested in moving your life, your money, your business, your investments out to Asia and you want to know the best way to do that, we can help you to make that happen. Now, this video is, part 3 of a 3-part series. The first one was, can you take your pension with you if you move overseas as an Australian? The second one was, if you take your pension and move overseas, what are the tax implications? And in this video, we're going to cover, if you do move overseas, what happens to your public health care, your Medicare access in Australia. So first up, what happens if you're just going on a holiday? You're still a tax resident, you're just going overseas for a while. Well, Medicare doesn't cover you while you're overseas, so you have to make sure that you take out a healthcare policy to cover your medical expenses if something were to happen while you're in that foreign country. And if you're interested in what your options are for healthcare, if you're going to Thailand in particular, we did make a video about that, so check out the link up above if you want to find out more. If you're going to a country that has a reciprocal healthcare agreement, so this might be somewhere like the UK, then you can go there and you might be able to use your Medicare card to cover some costs in that public healthcare system if they have the reciprocal agreement between that country and the Australian country's health system. Unfortunately, there aren't any countries in Asia that has a reciprocal healthcare agreement with Australia. So you're going to need a separate healthcare policy to cover you while you are overseas. Right, so what about if you're actually moving overseas, you're going there to live? Well, if you retain your Australian residency, I'm talking about residency for tax purposes here, your Medicare policy will stay active. You won't be able to use it overseas, but you'll be able to come back to Australia and use it. Now, if you're going to become a non-resident for tax purposes, from the date that you leave, 5 years after that date, your Medicare will expire. So again, you won't be able to use it overseas within that 5 years, but you will be able to come back to Australia to use it. And then if you maintain your non-resident status in Australia, they'll cut you off after 5 years. And another thing to note here is you can't renew your Medicare card from overseas. So if you're overseas and you need to come back to use Medicare, you have to come back, get a new card. That may take a bit of time. If you're here for too long waiting for the card, that might trigger some residency issues. If you can try and get a brand new card with at least 5 years validity on it before you go overseas to live, that would be the best option. And then of course it means if you were to go to a country that had a reciprocal agreement, you'd have that active card ready to go. Okay, so if you have switched over to non-resident status, you've gone overseas, you're living overseas, and you come back to use Medicare in Australia, will that affect your non-residency status in Australia? Well, there's no cut and dry rule here. Coming back to Australia as a non-resident will not automatically trigger residency status, but if you were someone who was sort of on the borderline when you were trying to convince the tax office that you were a non-resident rather than a resident, you still have economic and residential ties to Australia, for example, this won't help your case. So just keep that in mind, that if you do come back and you're creating an impression that you are overly reliant on the public healthcare system, the tax office might start asking questions about your residency status. All right, so if you've gone to live overseas for an extended period of time, you've told the tax office that you're a non-resident, so you're not paying tax in Australia as a resident, and you have been cut off from Medicare after 5 years, and then say 7 years later, you wanted to come back and put roots down in Australia and become a resident for tax purposes in Australia once again. Is there a process for getting back on Medicare? Yes, there is. It can take up to 6 months to get back onto Medicare, and you do have to provide certain levels of proof to convince the tax office that you are indeed coming back to live in Australia for good. So when you're submitting your application to re-enroll for Medicare, you have to provide a copy of your passport and at least 2 documents dated within the last 6 months that prove you've now returned to Australia. And not just returned, but returned to live. The 2 documents proving that you've now returned to Australia to live can either be 2 documents sourced in Australia, or 1 document from Australia and 1 document from the country you've left. So if you're moving overseas or thinking about moving overseas, what happens to the Medicare levy that you pay every year as an Australian tax resident? If you remain an Australian resident for tax purposes, you have to keep paying that Medicare levy if you're above the threshold, which will be most people. Whether you're actually living in Australia or not makes no difference. Again, whether you are actually using Medicare or not makes no difference. All that matters is whether the Australian Tax Office regards you as being a resident for tax purposes. But if you become a non-resident for tax purposes, you will no longer have to pay the Medicare levy. You will no longer have to pay the Medicare surcharge if you were paying that. And then when you go overseas and officially go non-resident, you will still retain access to Medicare for the 5 years, even though you're not paying the Medicare levy in that time. It doesn't cut you off automatically just because you stop paying the Medicare levy. They will still keep you on for 5 years before they cut you off. So that's it for the video, guys. I hope you found this informative. If you have any questions, hit us up in the comments below. If you're living overseas as a non-resident or as a resident and you want to share your experience with Medicare, getting off the roll, re-enrolling, share it in the comments below. I'm sure everyone would love to hear how you went with that. If you want any other help, head over to our website, offshoreinasia.com. You can book in a call there. You can drop in an inquiry form. If you have any questions, we'll do what we can to help.